what in the world is wisdom? Like, what is it really? Have you ever tried to define it? It's very difficult to get our head around what it is, because most of the time when you hear about wisdom or someone attempts to define it, they do it in very poetic form. Have you ever noticed that? You'll usually find it in something very artistic where someone's talking about this idea, which makes it a little bit ambiguous and unfortunately leaves it up to all kinds of interpretation and people defining it the way they want it to be defined. And so we've gone on this great search to get our head around something that we can't really get our head around. And one of the ways we've decided to do that is just to read more books. Like, we think that wisdom is the equivalent of having a big bookshelf with a lot of books on it. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you've walked into someone's office and you saw that they had walls of books and you thought they must be the wisest person on the planet. I'm going to let you in on a little secret about people with a lot of books. Because I have a lot of books. I haven't read most of them. The person that you saw, they probably haven't read most of them either. So to equate lots of books with lots of wisdom is probably not the best choice. But we think the more books we read, the more brains we'll have. And somewhere along the line, maybe when we were little kids, we decided that if you're really smart, like if you've got a lot of book smart and you've gone to a lot of classes, then you are a wise person. But you don't have to be around long to realize there is a stark difference between book smart and street smart, right? And what I've learned, at least in my own brain and heart, a lot of why I want wisdom, why I read books and want a bigger brain, so to speak, is so that I have more brawn. Because wisdom feels like influence, and it feels like power, and it feels like the ability to tell someone else what they should do with their life, right? Because we all want to be the owl. I don't know why we decided that the owl was the wisest animal in the animal kingdom, but the owl is always the wisest, and everybody goes to the owl to determine what they should do. And we would love to be in that position. It's okay to admit that. I would love to be in that position where people come to me and they go, what do you think I should do with my life? Because we're all thinking about what they should do with their life anyway, so if they just asked, it would be better. But the more I read about God's definition of wisdom, I'm realizing we're missing the point. When we make it about books and brains and brawn, we're missing the point of what wisdom is all about. And what I'm learning is it's less about what it is, and it's more about how we move as a result. And James is kind of the guy that pulls the curtain back and defines it or shapes it in the most unusual way for me, in a way that I had never thought about it before, but the more I think about it, the more I see he's totally right. You find what he says in what we've determined is the third chapter of James, and I wonder sometimes if we get to sit down with James, he'd go, that wasn't the third chapter, I just wrote a letter, like, just read the letter. But we need to find a way around these parts, and so we gave it a chapter and verse, and this is what James said. If you are wise and understand God's ways, prove it by living an honorable life, doing good works with the humility that comes from wisdom. What's interesting in these very first few sentences is that James does very little to give us a definition of what wisdom is. There's this ever-present push from him to prove it, prove what we believe. This has come up almost every week. You prove what you believe about God by living out what you believe about God. And in this case, he kind of starts to say, prove what you believe about you by living it out. So if you believe that you are wise, then there needs to be something to show for it. And so quickly we realize it's less a what and it's more a way of doing. Specifically, he says it's with humility. That part of what it means to be wise is to live humbly, to consider someone else better than yourself. That doesn't feel like wisdom at all, according to our definitions, does it? In fact, the Greeks, they always saw wisdom, and understand, James is writing in a day and age where the Greek culture was the culture. And Greeks defined wisdom as an intellectual thing. It was about knowledge of divine principles and truths. That if you could grasp those things, then you were wise. And here comes James, and he says, I'm a little less concerned about what you know, and I'm more concerned with the way you do your life. And he says, so live humbly. And that humility, he says, actually comes from wisdom. That the two go hand in hand. You really can't be someone that's considered wise and be arrogant. That, in other words, this isn't something that you go around touting. It's not something you go around preaching and telling everybody that you are. Just because you say you're wise doesn't mean you're wise, essentially. Because we're going to look at your life, James says. And I want you to, if you understand truly wisdom, and if you are this person that you think you are, then you're going to consider other people better than yourself, which, by the way, the Greeks also saw meekness or humility as weakness. So James is coming in very counter-cultural. And even though we live in 21st century America, we still operate often under a Greek way of thinking, particularly when it comes to wisdom. So James is coming alongside you and I today, and he's kind of going, I need you to think different about this idea. Because wisdom isn't so much a knowing or a doing, it's a howing. It's not so much what you know. Wisdom is not about, can you figure out the Pythagorean theorem? It's not so much, do you understand the way a nucleus in a cell or atom works, right? It's not, have you had so much experience that you can tell someone else how to have a better experience or a similar experience? And some of it is wrapped up in there. But James says wisdom is more about how you do your life, how you relate to other people, how you engage, how you converse, how you think about others. And for me, I've just never thought of wisdom as something that happens in the context of relationship, but James is really, really, really going to push us there. And it's going to get really uncomfortable because he's going to force us to examine why we're drawn to it and why we want it. Because some of the things that drive us to want it are the very things that counteract wisdom itself. This is what he says. But if you are bitterly jealous and there is selfish ambition in your heart, don't cover up the truth with boasting and lying. And I know that we're all very Christ-like people in here, and we would never boast or we would never lie, and we would never do anything out of selfish ambition. But James says, if it creeps in, if you have an off day and you're driven by selfish ambition, you are automatically not wise. And that's really difficult to think about because, again, for us, wisdom is often a selfish ambition in and of itself. Because we want to be better than someone else, we want to know more than someone else, or at the very least, we want to make our lives easier. And James says, if you're going to let bitter jealousy and selfish ambition kind of rule things for you, then you're not going to be considered wise from the most accurate definition that comes from God. That James, by the way, learned from his brother Jesus, so he should know. What's interesting is that the Greek word for selfish ambition that's used here, this is the only place in the New Testament you find it. There are other words that we've kind of translated similarly, but this word that James used, it only shows up here, and it existed before James, and it actually probably came from Aristotle. And here was Aristotle's definition of selfish ambition: narrow partisan zeal of factional, greedy politicians. And here's what's funny to me. We giggle and we go, well, I don't ever want to be associated in that category. And we could make all kinds of jokes about what he's saying here. But understand what he's saying, the opposite of wisdom is factional. It's division. It's brokenness. And he's going to point his finger directly at that in a minute, but it's interesting to me that he's going to over and over again saturate the discussion in the context of community and relationships. That the opposite of wisdom is selfish ambition, and he understood selfish ambition as division where there's argument and one-upsmanship and always trying to prove that you're smarter and you're better and all of those kinds of things. Because for James, wisdom is a heart issue. It's a heart issue. It's who you are at the core of you. And it's how you do what you do. Because we'll talk about doing things with all our heart. Or we put our whole heart into it. And our heart is kind of a measure of how we're doing what we're doing. And so James is going to come around and he goes, listen, wisdom, if you really, really want to understand wisdom and you really want to be wise, then you've got to get to the heart of the matter. Because it's not about words. He says, don't try and cover up a heart issue with boasting and lying, which in order to boast, you have to use words. In order to lie, you have to use words. And he says what often we do is with a lack of wisdom comes additional wording. The less wise we are, the more we talk. And this is true, isn't it? We have people in our lives who believe that they have a lot to offer you with their words. And you walk away from some of those conversations going, I'm not so sure they're what they think they are. What's easy is to point the finger at them and often forget about us and how we do the same thing. Sometimes just as a Christian, I do the same thing. And I forget that wisdom is kind of a relational deal. And I want to talk about the wisdom I believe I know, more and more words, which ends up less and less wise. You see, the truth is, the one thing I hope you walk out of here understanding more than anything else is this. Wisdom isn't a what, it's a how. Wisdom is not a what. It's not a thing that you can get. It's not a thing that you can learn. It's not a thing that you can figure out or discover. It's a how you do what you do. It's a way of life. And to me, that is a fundamental shift in how I think about this thing that's so hard to define called wisdom. James goes on from there. He's not done with the selfish ambition part. He says, for jealousy and selfishness are not God's kind of wisdom. They might be some other kind of wisdom, namely this kind. Such things are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. If you haven't picked up on this yet, James refuses to pull a punch. And he's going to tell it how it is, right? And we love people who tell it like it is, as long as they're not telling it to us. And so we read James and we're like, whoa, big fella. Like, demonic? And maybe, I don't know, I don't think so, but maybe he's using some hubris to try and make a point. But his point can't be missed. Selfishness and jealousy, they don't have any place in the profile of the wise. There's something else. So if those are the drivers, you're headed in the wrong direction. He goes on to say, for wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. Now here's what's interesting about this word here, disorder. Disorder is a way of disorganizing things or breaking things apart. And again, we come back to the relational idea of wisdom. Disorder is something that you and I experience often in our friendships when they no longer work. We experience it in our relationships with our parents or with our kids, or in the office or in the neighborhood or on the PTA or on our soccer team, or in the classroom that we have to go back to shortly. And James is making the argument the reason that there's disorder and that you experience that is because there's a lack of wisdom in the room. And there's a lack of wisdom in the room because everybody in the room is acting selfishly and jealousfully. We're making up a lot of words today. The truth is, disorder doesn't really get us anywhere. In fact, disorder and selfish ambition and this lack of wisdom is actually more cyclical than anything else. And you could look at this cycle and go, well, there's some kind of order there because there's shape and it has definition, but the truth is these arrows are going nowhere. They're not going to get you from point A to point B. They're just going to keep you spinning. And so here's what happens. The disorder that's created by a lack of wisdom starts with us comparing ourselves to other people. This is where the bitter jealousy comes in. We look to the right, we look to the left, and we go, I'm not that. Or they're better than me. Or they have something that I don't have. And we go, how do I measure up to them? And this will rob us of virtually every joy and good in life. When we start looking at other people and using them as the measuring stick in our life. Because what will inevitably happen is we'll go, how do we measure up? And then we'll start competing with them and we'll go, how do I pass them up? If they're further along than me and I want to get better than them, then I'm going to do everything I can to pass them. And James is just making the argument like that's not wise. Because that's selfishness. That's ambitious, but that's ambition for yourself. And in the end, the third leg of the cycle is we just covet what we don't have. And we spend more of our life wanting what isn't instead of celebrating what is. And he says that's the antithesis of wisdom. This is literally banging your head against the wall. And every single one of us, if we came across someone after the service is over, banging their head against the wall, you go, that's not smart. That's not a wise thing to do. You're going to hurt yourself. But this is what we do all the time. And James says, to remedy the issue, don't go looking in a book. Because wisdom isn't in a book. It's in a relationship. This comparing and competing and coveting, the selfishness, the jealousy, that's all relational language. This is not an intellectual thing. The wisdom that God cares about and wants for you is the wisdom that allows you to be connected in a healthy way with other people. Navigating relationships well. Instead of getting caught in this cycle that leads to solitude and loneliness and frustration. That's just not wise. And then he starts to wrap it up in this way. He says, but the wisdom from above is first of all pure. It's also peace-loving, gentle at all times, and willing to yield to others. It's full of mercy and the fruit of good deeds. It shows no favoritism and is always sincere. What part of those few sentences was not relational? It's all relational. It's all how you treat someone else and interact with the people around you. And he gives this profile that's not about how many books you've read or classes you've taken. It's about how many people you're loving and that you're yielding to, But this is the definition of wisdom. Because built into wisdom is an application. And this is where things start to fall apart. The difference between knowledge and wisdom is that wisdom is the knowledge we have applied in the context of a relationship. So think of it like this, the apps on your smartphone. I know that we don't all enjoy smartphones, but most of us have them these days. It's in the name. Have you ever thought about this? It's in the name. We call them apps. There are tens of thousands of apps that exist in the Apple Store or the Google Store or the whatever store you go to get your apps. You know what app stands for or is short for? Application. It's a program that you apply in the context of a relationship. So you all have a text messaging app. Even if you've got a dumb phone, you've got a text messaging app now. And here's what's interesting. If you never ever use the text messaging component of your phone, then you do not have an app on your phone. You have a program. Because the app is about connecting you and allowing you to have a conversation with someone else. It's about building a connection. In fact, that's what almost every smartphone app is about now. Even the games are about connecting you with other people, and you play the game with someone else. When you apply it to your life, it's an app. When you leave it on your phone and it doesn't do anything, it's just a program. And you know what I do with programs? I delete them. Because I need more space in my life. I need more space in my phone. And James says that the nature of wisdom is that it is an application. It's something intended to connect you with other people. It's not just something to have. And a lot of us have a lot of apps doing nothing. And so when wisdom is not doing anything, when it's not applied to our relationships, you just know some stuff. And what good does that do? What good does having a bunch of facts and a bunch of formulas and a bunch of things on your shelf do if it doesn't make any difference? So, James says this. Actually, he says, and those who are peacemakers, this is how he wraps it up, will plant seeds of peace and reap a harvest of righteousness. He goes through this whole long list, and then he concludes it with the end result of wisdom. The end result of you applying this into the context of relationships will be righteousness. Well, what in the world is righteousness? Here's my oversimplified definition of it. It's behavior that pleases God. And so the conclusion that James is making is, listen, when you live wisely, wisdom pleases God. He kind of invented the whole thing. He came up with the idea. And he has been defining it through James. So when we live wisely, that pleases God. And here's what's so cool. The way that James concludes his kind of discussion on wisdom ties in with something that he had heard his brother say. Jesus was preaching on the side of a mountain, and we call it the Sermon on the Mount, and he was talking about what some of us would call the Beatitudes, or it's Jesus kind of defining what his followers would look like. And one of them goes like this. You find it in Matthew 5. God blesses those who work for peace, for they will be called children of God. And again, when James says peacemaker, and here Jesus says the people that work for peace, that is relational. If you're all by yourself with a head full of knowledge, there is no need for peace. You already got it. It's built in. Peace, by definition, requires another. And so Jesus and James are both pointing us toward wisdom happens in the context of community, not in the isolation of knowledge. And so what I'm struggling with lately is am I asking the wrong question? Am I asking the wrong question about other people? Or maybe better, am I asking the wrong question about me? Because most of us would go like this: am I wise? And we have created a profile in our minds of what a wise person looks like. And if we had started this way, it would be interesting to me if at the very beginning I said, hey, take out a piece of paper and you create a profile of someone who is wise. I would bet like a lot of coffee at least, that some of you would have said they've gone to a lot of school, they've read a lot of books, and they've experienced a lot of life. That's our profile. But James comes along and he says, no, that's not wisdom. That's not the profile of wisdom. That's God's wisdom, at least. He says, here's a better question to ask. Instead of asking, am I wise, ask, am I humble? Do I consider other people better than myself? Do I put their needs before my own? Do I look at the value in other people instead of constantly finding their faults so that I can feel better about my own value? He said, when you're done wrestling with that question, maybe ask this one: do I work for peace? Is that what I'm known for? Not someone who appreciates peace, not someone who thinks it's a good idea kind of in my brain or in an ideal world, but someone who actually makes time and dedicates energy and resources and is passionate about peace. Is that me? Third, you'd say, am I gentle? Go back and read what James said. This kind of wisdom, God's kind of wisdom, results in gentleness. So am I gentle or am I harsh? Do I try and beat down someone in an argument so that I can win? Or do I listen? And do I hear them out? And maybe disagree, but doing so gently. Next, do I yield to others? And again, right away, I'm like, wait a minute. This doesn't feel like the owl. Because Rabbit and Winnie the Pooh and Piglet, they yielded to the owl. They said, what do you think we should do? And James says, no, you yield to others. That's how you know if you're wise or not. Where you see yourself as a learner that can learn from others. Don't worry, it gets worse. Am I merciful? Am I merciful? Like, not just, again, do I appreciate it? Do I think other people should be merciful? But am I? And do I love it? Like, do I want it? Remember, the definition of mercy is when someone doesn't get what they deserve. So, for me, when something like they're getting what they deserve, or it's about time, or something like that, that I have disqualified myself as someone of wisdom. Because someone who's wise is merciful. Do I favor some? Remember, he said don't show any favoritism, and we talked a couple weeks ago about that whole idea. James is very clear about that. And then finally, am I sincere? Or am I boasting, stretching the truth, exaggerating? Am I giving flattery? Am I just blowing smoke at people so they will like me? Or am I sincere? This is the profile of the wise. At least according to James and Jesus. So what would it look like if instead of going, how can I become more wise, we started saying, how can I become more humble? How can I become more of a peacemaker? How can I become more gentle? How can I become more yielding to other people? And that if we got those ducks in a row and we started working on those things, then wisdom just comes naturally. Because I think sometimes we just get the proverbial cart before the horse and we want to go after wisdom and we hope that it'll make us these other things. And James says, no, remember, wisdom isn't a what? It's a how. And so if you want that in your life, then change the way you interact with others. And I know, I feel the tension because it's the same tension that I felt. Okay, but what if I'm not humble? And what if I really hate mercy? And what if I struggle to be sincere? And what if I struggle to yield? Like what if I've determined that given that profile, I don't have any wisdom? There's really good news. And James gave the spoiler 2 chapters before we got to the chapter that we read this morning. This is what he says. If you need wisdom, ask our generous God, and he will give it to you. And here's the best part. He will not rebuke you for asking. Because isn't this amazing? This is how, if you're not a Christian, you may not think this way, but my Christian brain sometimes goes, I know God could help me with this, but I'm embarrassed to ask him for it because he'll probably be a little mad that I don't already have it. Right? Like, is God going to go, hey, I put that in the book. I made sure that lasted like thousands of years for you to read, and you should know better. You should already have this down. You've been a Christian for a long time. James says, listen, that's not how God works. If you need wisdom, if you need the kind of wisdom that comes from above, then just ask from above. And God will give it to you because he's generous. He loves to give that to you. You just need to ask. You just need to ask. And so what would it look like for you and I to start every single day with, God, will you please give me wisdom today? Understanding what we are asking for and what we aren't asking for. We're not asking for some special knowledge. We're not asking for some high intellectual level. We're asking for God to help us be humble, peace-seeking, gentle, sincere, honoring others. That's what we're asking God to give us. So what if you and I, every single day, we started with, God, will you help me be wise today? And what you are asking for is God to give you people. Because you need people to be wise. Because it's relational, not intellectual. Reimagine what it would look like for you to be wise in your families. Reimagine what it would look like to be wise in your dating relationships. Reimagine what it would look like for you to be wise on your team or with your club or with your neighbors. You might start to see disorder ordered because you have discovered wisdom. Let's pray. So God, we'll just start today. Heavenly Father, will you help us be wise? Will you help us to fit the profile of wisdom from above? Will you help us to not be selfish? Will you help us to not be jealous? Will you help us to understand that so foundational to the life that you've called us to and the things you want for us happen in the context of community and deal in relationships? Help us to get that. Help us to do that well. Because God, we want wisdom, but we want your wisdom. So please, will you help us with that this week? Will you help remind us each and every morning to ask our generous Heavenly Father to provide the wisdom we need to get through the day that he has planned for us? God, bring that to our mind. We love you so, so much. Thank you for James. Thank you for his bold, cutting words. and preserving them all these centuries so that we could learn from them. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.